Welcome to Flourishing in Faith, the place where you can discover stories of hope, truth, and glory, as well as find life hacks to live your faith more fully. Hi, I'm Julie, a daughter of God, certified professional life coach, wife, and mother of four. After trying to do everything the wrong way, I've been overwhelmed by healing, joy, and freedom through Jesus and the gifts of grace He makes available to each and every one of us. My passion is to share what I've been given with others. I'm glad you're here. Let's begin. Hey guys, thanks for listening today. If you haven't noticed, I had the opportunity to interview people lately, and that has been an awesome change and addition to the way that we've been doing this podcast, but also very time consuming to do a 45-minute interview editing versus the little 10-minute ones that I had been doing. And so on the weeks that I do the longer episodes, they'll just be the one weekly episode. And then if it's shorter episodes, we'll do more than one per week, getting back to how we had been doing it. So I hope the stories that you've gotten to hear have been a blessing to you. I know they've touched me. And if they have been a blessing to you, just please share them. Share it with someone you think might get something out of it. That would mean so much. So last week, someone asked me what my story was, what my testimony was. And so I'm going to attempt to share that with you today. Growing up, my grandfather was a deacon, a treasurer, one of the founding members of a small town Baptist church. And he was a very devout, kind man, full of integrity, who had a very solid faith. He and all his family, going back generations and generations, they had been Baptist. One of the things that I'll never forget, and I've always been very grateful for, is that my grandfather and his siblings and his extended family, they all sincerely believed. They sincerely spoke to God in prayer. And I could tell by the way they prayed that they knew God as Father. Out of that faith, my grandfather walked his fatherhood and his role as grandfather in a way that was so loving. And he was one of the people who loved me the most growing up. And it had a profound impact on me. I looked up to him a lot. He taught me how to drive a stick shift in his old red beat up pickup truck in the back cornfields when I was young. And he took me four-wheeling and fishing. And he took me to church on Sunday. And my grandmother, she played the piano for the services. They would volunteer to help build houses with Habitat for Humanity. And they loved their neighbors. My grandparents showed me what it meant to actually walk your faith, to live your faith. My grandfather loved his wife. He loved my grandma. And I thank God every day for the gift of faith that I got to witness. And so I had that growing up, and that was great. And my mother really encouraged me in faith. She got me a kid's Bible, and she would hide dollar bills throughout the kid's Bible. And so then if I read that far, I would get to keep the money. And I actually found that Bible in the basement a few years ago, and it still had dollar bills in it because I never finished reading it. But I thought, I knew she cared. I knew she cared that I learned about the faith. Now, my dad, you have heard in some of the previous episodes that my dad had been betrayed and hurt by his father. My paternal grandfather was a man who purported to be a man of God. In fact, he was a member of the clergy within a church, but he ended up falling into scandal. He was, I would say, a womanizer, and he left my grandmother and ended up ultimately taking his own life. It was very sad. I never met him, but I witnessed the impact that his choices had in my dad's life. And that wound made it very painful for my father to walk into a church. And so my parents were often divided. Sometimes we would go to a Baptist church if we were visiting my mom's side of the family. Sometimes we would go to Christmas with my dad's side of the family, and they would take me to an Episcopalian service, which was beautiful. And thankfully, we did get baptized. I always felt such a sense of peace anytime we would go to church, and we would sing and we would pray together, and we'd be surrounded by our extended family. And that was always a really special moment for me growing up, a respite from anything else that was going on. I remember when I first realized what the gospel meant. I was 7, 8, maybe 9, and I remember I had a Bible in my room, and I was by myself, and I kneeled down to pray in front of a cross, and I was overwhelmed. I was struck by this notion, by this knowledge that Jesus loved me, that he personally loved me, and he loved me perfectly, and he loved every single person in the world that much too. And I was so filled with joy and confidence. And I ran downstairs to tell my older brother and dad, and I think they were watching The Simpsons, and they just stared at me like I was delusional. It seemed they didn't want to hear a word of what I had to say. And I started to think hiding this light under a bushel basket might be the safest route if I wanted to be accepted in my family and by society. We had some trouble in our family when I was about 12. And I'll just say it was a dark time. And at the same time, God brought a lot of healing and hope and restoration out of that struggle. But by the time I turned 16, I decided I wanted to find out for myself. I experimented with all the things. I became reckless. I heard a quote this week from a new program called She Shall Be Called Woman, and their speaker, Kate Hartfield, shared something that was certainly true for me. She said basically, a person who does not love themselves will spend their time chasing after other people who don't love them either. And our behavior flows from our identity. And I did not know my identity any longer as a beloved daughter of God, because once I consciously chose to do things that I knew were wrong, once I violated Jesus speaking to me in my conscience, I was a mess, and I couldn't trust myself. I didn't look out for myself. I didn't take care of myself. And I did all these things that I knew were wrong. And so I fell into a very dark place where I was looking for other people to tell me what my identity was, to tell me what my worth was, to prove to me, to reflect back to me what I was worth. And I was going to the wrong people for that, as you can imagine. So I fell further and further away from the goodness and the grace of God by my own choices. And I was blind to his love. I was deaf to his words. I was sick with the disease of sin, and I wanted to be numb, and I wanted to self-medicate. I was self-centered, completely selfish, and I was in a dark place of depression and desolation. I influenced my friends for the worst during this time, and I'm so sorry about that. I led people the wrong way. And I believe, and I have been told, that my family, my extended family, especially my Baptist family, that they were covering me in prayer. And I will forever be grateful for the prayers of my loving cousins and extended family who prayed for me and interceded for me. And I know that their prayers were like a shield that I couldn't see, an invisible shield. And at one particularly low point at this phase in my life, God sent a literal missionary into my path. You can listen to that part of the story in the episode titled Challenging Life Hack and a Story About a Stranger Telling Me My Life. I go into detail about it there. But I encountered Jesus through that missionary on campus when I was lost. And being lost from God, for me, looking back now, it was like being underwater, and it's the middle of the night and you don't know how to swim, and you realize that you're not going to make it and that no one's coming to help you. You lose hope. encountering Jesus in that dark time for me was like the lights being flooded, turned on, and hearing someone call me by name, someone who loved me deeply, and reach their hand into the water to pull me out so I could see again, so I could hear again, so I could breathe again. And so after I had that encounter with Jesus that I talk about in that other episode, I received that with joy. But like it says in Luke chapter 8, those seeds of faith were like seeds that fell on the rocky soil. And when they grew, they withered. The plants withered for lack of moisture. And Jesus said that is those people who, when they hear the good news, they receive the word with joy, but they have no root. And they believe only for a time, and then they fall away in times of trial. And that is what I did over and over again. And I found myself on the hard bathroom floor crying more than once. I had no friends who really believed, and by the grace of God and with what little self-respect I had left at this time in my life, I was able to untangle myself from the more toxic and unhealthy relationships I had. And I prayed for God to send me a good man. I had seen good men. I had known good men. I knew they existed. And so I prayed to God and I asked him for one. And it was in that time that I met the man who is now my husband. The first time I laid eyes on him, I knew I would marry him. I was sure, and I'm not normally sure about anything. And I went home and I told my roommate that day, I just met my future husband. And it would be 2 more years before we even started to date. And my grandmother had recently passed away, and my mother and I to this day believe that my grandmother actually interceded for me in heaven and helped to bring us together. The only thing was he had been raised Catholic, but that was no matter because he didn't know his faith well enough to defend it from all my hostility and attacks. I really did have this unconscious prejudice against Catholics. He grew up in the church, but he thought confirmation was like graduation, and he had been what we call sacramentalized, but not evangelized. And so we did the Christmas Easter thing. I remember one time after college, I was working a managerial job in a retail store, and it was late one Christmas Eve. We finished our shift. The coworker and I, we went out, we took shots to celebrate, and then I went to church with my fiance. I had no respect for what I was encountering, and I certainly felt Jesus was a threat to the way I wanted to live, that he was out to steal my freedom and not to bless me. We tried to find a church, though. We did find a non-denominational one that was encouraging. We never really became disciples of Christ. We were his fans, but we were not his followers. We'd cheer Jesus on and sing songs about him on Sunday, but we had zero intention of taking up any sort of cross to follow him. That is for sure. We enjoyed our prosperity gospel almost and continued in our sinful lives. Seeds were being planted though. And I remember specifically that there were these women at the church and they had this aura about them. They were holy. They were happy. They were free. They loved others and they were not obsessed with themselves or their own misery. And I wanted what they had, but I didn't know how to get it. I was so curious though. And so I just wanted to be around them. Maybe I could take notes and figure it out. And so I did join a group at church. It was January 1st. It was a new year. And we were encouraged by the pastor to pray for 2 specific things. So this is very powerful. So if you are feeling like you're ready to take your faith to the next level, but you keep falling away in times of trial, I want you to listen up. Try this. Do 2 very important things. The first one is going to be very life-changing and very important, but it might seem impossible because I know for me at the time it did seem impossible. Number 1, we were encouraged to pray for God to send us 5 strong friends of faith. 5 friends who were people after God's own heart. And I will say at this time in my life, I had no friends who were actually full disciples of Christ. And so I wrote that prayer in my Bible. Prayer number 1, Lord, please send us friends of faith. And I should say at this point, we had gotten married and we had a baby on the way. And I did not want to raise my children in a situation like what my parents had to go through. I didn't want one parent wanting to go to church and the other parent who was indifferent or uninterested. I wanted us to be united. At this point, we were moving to a new city and we were going to need to find a new church. And so I prayed number 2, that my husband would start to have an interest in faith, that he would become a spiritual leader in our family, and that he would have even an opinion about what do we do, where do we go, what church we should join, because he was a bit disengaged and indifferent to the church that we had been going to. And I was sad about that. And I was afraid because I had seen how difficult that was for my parents to walk through the pain that existed from the generational stuff that had happened. We had our first child, we had our second child, and our marriage, it was rocky. I was resentful. I was keeping score. I was jealous of him. I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. I didn't know what I needed. And one day, in the midst of this, he came to me and he said he was going to go check out the local Catholic church. And I was not happy about that. And he came back from Mass and he said that's where he wanted to start going. After not really being interested at all in his faith and going with me to all these other Protestant and non-denominational churches, that he wanted to re-embrace his Catholic faith. And I was pissed. I was so upset. The worst thing was he finally had an opinion about church, but it was the wrong opinion. This was the last place I ever wanted to go. I had a litany of reasons why the Catholic Church was wrong. As I'm thinking these thoughts, that little voice says to me in my heart, Julie, you prayed for this. This is an answer to your prayer. And it stopped me in my tracks. And I resigned myself to going with him the following weekend, even though I had to drag my feet to go, but I did show up because I couldn't deny it was an answered prayer. Okay, guys, the baby's awake. I gotta take a pause here, but I will finish this to be continued. Part 2 we will do at the next episode. Thanks. Thank you for listening to Flourishing in Faith. You can learn more about this ministry, share prayer requests, send questions, or even share your own glory story by visiting lifewithchristisbeautiful.com. If you found this episode helpful and think others might too, please rate us and review us or share this with others. All right, lovelies. As Pope Francis says, please pray for me. I'll be praying for you. Thanks.